Hi everyone, it's Mrs. Fletcher. I want to spend a little time helping those students who were absent for the Cosette discussion to know what to focus on and what we talked about in class. So in class, we went through this whole slideshow. It's 8 questions. We spent some time talking in groups, and then those groups reported back and shared information. So this won't take as long as it did in class because we're not doing that speaking component and interacting with each other. So here are the first 2 questions. Discuss Waterloo. What is happening here? Maybe know the sequence of events. Write an explanation of the 2 characters in this section. Distinguishing characteristics, like how are we going to know who they are, and what kinds of men are these? So here's a little background. We've talked about some of this before. On the left, we have the monarchy, and a monarchy is a form of government in which there are kings and queens. People are born into their office. They're not elected. You're just lucky if you happen to be born into that royal family. And those lines of leaders often continue for a long time. In France, there was a wealthy nobility and royalty, and then many poor people who would never have those kind of opportunities. That was their traditional government. Then there was upheaval because, as we've said, there were many injustices occurring. And so people fought to become a republic. This was the French Revolution. And a republic means it's what we have in the United States. It's by and for the people. We have elections. Potentially anyone can grow up and be a leader in the United States in a republic. So similar to what we're doing here. Remember that the French were looking for 3 things that are symbolized on their flag: liberty, equality, and brotherhood. So one of the leaders, and he actually was an emperor, and we would probably call him a president, but he was an emperor of the Republic, was Napoleon Bonaparte. And he's a figure in history. He's a famous figure and is known for trying to conquer more and more territory for France when he got into power. And so he was invading other countries and battling other countries and trying to make France this superpower. And is often the case that, this happens in modern day with the United States, with one superpower is trying to take over more territory than maybe they should, and they're killing people and they are ruining other governments and their power is getting too great, then another superpower is usually going to step in and try to temper that. And so this battle that we're talking about, Waterloo, is just one of those. It was between the French army and the British. The British won. And so our book picks up at the aftermath of this battle, and there are just bodies everywhere. It's this terrible scene at the Battle of Waterloo afterwards. And so that's where we pick up and start the Cosette section. And so that part can be a little confusing because it just starts off talking about this man who is prowling around and he's stealing off of the dead bodies. He's taking jewelry, he's taking what they would call purses, wallets, and he is part of the French army, but obviously he's a traitor because he's stealing off of his own men. And he is none other than this man we already know, Sergeant Thénardier. And he is a sergeant. He has risen through some ranks in the army. And I put him here in the middle because, in my opinion, this man does not necessarily have a political belief. He is just an opportunist, and he's going to go wherever he can get by, commit crimes, steal from people, get a leg up. And so I don't see him as being very loyal to either side. So I stuck him in the middle. He'll kind of go wherever. On the bottom here, under Napoleon, we have a man who fought for Napoleon, and his name is Pontmercy, George Pontmercy. Oops. And he introduces himself at the end of this section. So we want to know him. He's important to the book. And so I'm going to go back for a second to our questions. So what's happening in Waterloo, as I said, is that Thénardier, same guy we knew before, the innkeeper who treated Cosette so badly when she was little, time has passed, right? So time has passed. He's in the French army and he is looting. He's stealing off of these bodies. And he comes along and sees a gold ring on a man's hand. And this body connected to it is under a bunch of other dead bodies. And so he's pulling on the ring and trying to get it off of this man's finger. And as he does that, he pulls the man from under that pile. And the man kind of wakes up. And of course, he's all bleary and he has a terrible wound. He has a huge saber cut across his face. A saber is a kind of sword. And so he was seriously injured in battle and he's out of it. But he wakes up enough to say, "Oh my gosh, thank you for saving me. You pulled me out. You saved my life." And so at the very end of the section, when they've been having this little conversation, the man who had been under the bodies says, "What is your name?" Sergeant Thénardier. "And your name?" And he says, "And my name is Georges Pontmercy." And essentially he thinks that Thénardier has saved his life, and so he feels indebted to him. And Pontmercy says, "I shall not forget that name, and you remember mine. My name is Pontmercy." So that's how we know at the end of the section who these two men are. So here's Pontmercy down here. Just remember, he's on the side of the Republic, and he is important to us later in the book. All right, next, another man. Who is Boulatruelle? What does he see in this section, and why do you think this part is in the book? What is its significance? So this is a subtle part of Cosette, and that's why I wanted to point it out. If you go a couple of pages, on page 142, you'll see that this is where Boulatruelle shows up. And so Boulatruelle lives in the same town of Montfermeil, where Cosette was brought up in the inn. And he's an ex-convict, but he now lives in this town. And he sees someone come to the forest near Montfermeil, and he has a case or a box. And he sees him go into the forest. And later he finds a pick, and he puts it two and two together. He recognizes Jean Valjean. He doesn't tell anybody that that's Jean Valjean, but he recognizes him. So because he knows that he was in the galleys also, he thinks, this is a case of money. And so then Boulatruelle spends all of his time digging up the forest, trying to find where Jean Valjean buried this box. So here's what happened. On Fantine's deathbed, Javert came to arrest Jean Valjean. And he did. He took him into custody. But very soon after, Jean Valjean escaped from that custody. And he was gone for 3 to 4 days. And then he was recaptured in Paris. So in the 3 to 4 days that he was gone, it says that he took out about 600,000 or 700,000 francs. And my students have done the conversions and adjusted for inflation in the past and so on. And that is millions. And so this isn't a small amount of money that he went and withdrew. It's a lot of money. And within that time, that's when he goes to the forest and he buries it. So know that sequence of events. Then Jean Valjean is recaptured in Paris, and he was supposed to die, actually, because of his crimes and escaping and the crimes we've talked about previously. But the judge shows mercy on him, and so he sentences him to life in prison. And he's sentenced to a work crew on this ship Orion. And if you look on page 140, you'll see that's where the ship Orion starts. So you need to know how he eventually escapes off of this working ship and then goes and gets Cosette, because in this section, he finally does go and get Cosette. All right, in the fulfillment to the promise of the departed section, find indirect characterization of the Thénardiers. So this is Mrs. Thénardier, right? What does this indirect characterization say about her? So remember, this starts on page 147, and know that it goes for about 30 pages as our story is going along. There are many times when you can figure out who she is. Indirect characterization means that the character is being shown to you. So through her actions, through her words, through what other people say about her, What do you learn? What does she show you about who she is as a person? And so my students in class came up with some excellent evidence. In this part, you're looking for actual evidence. So we were practicing that. They talk about the fact that at one point, Cosette has a black eye, and the black eye was given to her by the Thénardiers. And then she makes fun of Cosette for having a black eye. And so it's very hypocritical because she caused it and then she makes fun of it. They also brought up that this woman has two faces, right? One that she shows to Cosette and one she shows to customers, especially customers who have money who walk into her inn. And when the customer turns their back, she might give Cosette an actual kick under the table. She sends Cosette out into the forest in the middle of the night to fetch water from a creek or stream. And Cosette doesn't want to go. She's terrified. It's cold. It's wintertime. She has terrible clothes because you know that Mrs. Thénardier has given all the money that Fantine sent to her little girls. She clothes them very well. She takes care of them, but Cosette is really treated like a slave. So there are so many times within these pages that you can see who she is. But I'm going to read you an important part on page 149. This is right before the break on page 149. This is important because you may not have realized that the Thénardiers have a son. You know they have two daughters, Eponine and Anselma. They also have a son, and you'll see that on page 149. At intervals, the cry of a very young child, which was somewhere in the house, was heard above the noise of the barroom. This was a little boy, which the woman had had some winters before. I don't know why, she said. It was the cold weather. I don't know why I had this kid. It was cold that year. And which was a little more than 3 years old. The mother had nursed him, but did not love him. When the hungry clamor of the brat became too much to hear, "Your boy is squalling," said Thénardier. "Why don't you go and see what he wants?" "Bah!" answered the mother. "I'm sick of him." And the poor little fellow continued to cry in the darkness. So this little boy is important to us. You want to know who he is, that he's their youngest child, and how he was treated as he was growing up. He's important in the book later. And so she neglects her child. And that's a good example of indirect characterization. By what she says and what she does, we find out who she is. So you can find more examples of her. 5, find the characterization of Cosette on page 162. I had students read it aloud. They were supposed to find the sentences that were the most impactful, and then find an exceptional example of personification on that same page. And so if you look on page 162, there's a large paragraph here about Cosette, about how she looked when she was living with the Thénardiers. It talks about the corners of her mouth had that curve of habitual anguish, which is seen in the condemned and in the hopelessly sick. She was always shivering. She had acquired the habit of drawing her knees together. Her whole dress was nothing but a rag. Her naked legs were red and rough. The hollows under her collarbones would make one weep. She's very, very thin. The whole person of this child, her gait, that means the way she walks, her attitude, the sound of her voice, the intervals between one word and another, her looks, her silence, her least motion, expressed and uttered a single idea: fear. A lot of students liked that last sentence in that section about how everything about her just, it sends the message of fear. That's what she looks like, someone who is afraid. And then the personification, one example is here on the bottom of the page. Fear was spread all over her. She was, so to say, covered with it. Fear drew back her elbows against her sides, drew her heels under her skirt, and made her take the least possible room, prevented her from breathing more than was absolutely necessary, and had become what might be called her bodily habit, without possible variation except of increase. There was in the depth of her eye an expression of astonishment mingled with terror. So remember that personification is giving something non-human, human traits. And so when we're talking about how fear drew back her elbows against her sides, drew her heels under her skirt, and she just becomes as small as is humanly possible out of fear, that's personification. It's almost like fear becomes a person, a character who's doing that to her. So that's just an example of Hugo's brilliance as a writer. So I wanted you to notice some of those things. All right, 7. Jean Valjean buys the doll for Cosette and gives it to her on page 169. What does this doll symbolize in the story? So, as we've talked about with symbolism, there are many, many right answers. You just have to justify what you're thinking. So, she has seen this beautiful doll in town, but Cosette is never allowed to play. So, with symbolism, be sure you're always thinking about the thing, the fact that it's a doll. So, Hugo has other options. This could have been a dog. It could have been a dress. Could have been a hat. But it's not. It's a toy. It's a doll specifically. And then again, it could have been a jump rope or a top or a little car. It's not. It's a doll. And authors like this don't do things randomly. They don't write randomly. He chose that doll for her. So then you think about, well, what is a doll just in regular life? Well, it's a toy, which means that it has to do with play, which she was never allowed to do. What do we do with dolls? We dress them. Sometimes kids bathe them. They might pretend to feed them. They hold them like a baby, right? They care for them. So it's significant that it's that toy that is purchased for her. And my students came up with all kinds of ideas, like that the doll could symbolize hope for the future, that it is all the care and love that she's going to give this doll is what she has never received. A lot of students said it could be a new beginning for her, and she is about to set off with Jean Valjean in her new life. And so that's pretty smart for symbolism in terms of a new life, a new beginning. A baby is a new life, a new beginning, right? Okay, so think about the doll a little bit. Last one. What new thing enters Jean Valjean's soul on pages 183 to 186, and how can you explain this new development? So most of my students could very quickly say love. That is the first time he's ever felt love. But we want to find some evidence to that fact and be able to explain how that happened. So on page 183, it says something new was entering his soul. This is at the top. Jean Valjean had never loved anything. For 25 years, he had been alone in the world. He had never been a father, lover, husband, or friend. And if you think about his life, when he was in his 20s, we hear about his family, his sister, his nieces, his nephews, but there's no mention of love, even though they're a family. They're just so desperate to get from one day to the next and to get food on the table. There are no pages dedicated to that being a loving family. Then he goes to prison for stealing the bread, and he's in prison for 19 years. No love there. He escapes, right? Or he's let out. We pick up the story then. And although he is trying to be a good person and an honest person, there's no love happening in his life in any of those times. And I don't read anything creepy in the love between Jean Valjean and Cosette. It says on the bottom of page 183, he was 55 and Cosette was but 8 years. And it also talks about how they immediately were drawn to each other. Now think about this. She's a young child. She's terrified. She's out in the woods getting water. She is so desperate right at that moment, so terrified before he walks onto the scene that she just says, "Oh my God," like she almost can't function. And then here's this man, and she trusts him immediately and goes with him immediately, feels comfortable with him immediately. Maybe because she really needs him. She needs someone to care for her. She needs a father. And the same for him. He needs someone in his life as well. It says on page 184, this is in the third paragraph down, in that mysterious moment when their hands touched, they were welded together. This is when he takes her hand and holds it. When their two souls saw each other, they recognized that they were mutually needed and they closely embraced. So he's feeling love for the first time at 55 years old. On page 186, it says, she called him father and knew him by no other name. All right, so we did not cover everything in the Cosette section. That's not necessarily our purpose because I am going to be assessing whether you have read and whether you understand what is happening in the book. So I have a list here at the end of the slideshow about other parts of Cosette that you should feel familiar with, be able to talk about, be able to explain. So as we said, one is Jean Valjean's escape from the ship. He's sentenced to work on this ship. How does he escape so that he can go get Cosette? Know about the beggar. Mendicant is another word for beggar. So there's a beggar in this section. He's important. There's a chase scene. So know who's running, who's chasing, what's going on. Jean Valjean and Cosette eventually have to escape. And so know how that happens. And then finally, the convent, which is a home for nuns where no men are allowed to be. Jean Valjean and Cosette are allowed to stay, and you need to know the deal that made that possible. And there's a great coincidence involved when they come to the convent. And as we know, Hugo loves coincidence. So be sure that you know what that coincidence is that leads them to be able to live there. All right, if you have any questions before you take your test, be sure that you email me or talk to me when you come back to class. Thank you.